Hi, my name is Daniel Ransom. I work in the area of sport and performance psychology, and I've been working in professional soccer for the past 6 years. My areas of interest lie in psychology and talent development, in particular how the environment influences individual psychology and how the environment influences talent development. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes discussing this approach to talent development, which focuses on the environment, which is of course one perspective, and there are others. However, I'm going to spend some time discussing this environmental approach to give some insight background into where this comes from and how this can influence our practice on a day-to-day basis. My interest in this area stemmed from working with a group of coaches and discussing how what their roles are as coaches, what is their job, what do they do. And one thing which stood out to me when doing this piece of work was this statement, which was, "Give me an hour with anyone and I will make them a better player." I found this interesting, particularly because of the emphasis on them, on their role as being the educator, their role as being the one who would be imparting knowledge on the player, and it would be their responsibility to make that player better. And I found that interesting for a number of reasons, really, because that obviously puts the coach in a position of power, position of authority, that they have the knowledge, and their job is to pass that on to the player and to improve the player. And I found that I found that information interesting, partly for a number of reasons, but one, thinking about how does that influence the player, how does that influence the way that the player feels, how does that influence the interactions that they have with the player, and the way they work together. So I'm going to spend some time discussing this approach, looking at trying to help us understand that actually for adults working with talented athletes, being aware of the environment that we create and our influence on it is the single most important factor in talent development. And the reason I'm going to argue this is because, relating back to the comment from the coach about them being responsible for making the player better, I think there's a huge deal of influence that we have as adults who work with developing athletes, particularly in professional soccer. Coaches are often the ones who have a great deal of power and influence over the environment. They create the context. They're the ones who make the decisions as to whether developing athletes play organised games from a very young age, whether they play multi-sports. So this immense power and influence over the developing athlete and children, I feel, requires a great deal of serious consideration and responsibility to be taken for it. So that's what I'm going to spend some time discussing, particularly because one of the things we know about talent development is that it's really complex. We know it's not simply the fact that the biggest, strongest, tallest developing athletes will go on to be senior players, and we know that from a number of angles, but particularly in a sport like professional soccer, where even in recent times the raging debate about who is the world's best player, is it Leo Messi, is it Cristiano Ronaldo, which is obviously an ongoing debate. However, when we look at these two players, they've got very different physical profiles, they're very different people, very different backgrounds, yet they are both competing with each other to be the world's best player. So we know that there must be a range of different characteristics and skills that are required in order to reach the elite level. And we know that varies by sport. We know that varies depending on the nature of the sport, but more so in a game like professional soccer, where there are so many variables involved. We need to recognise that developing talent is complex, and it must go beyond just the individual. One of the other things we do know about talent development is that it's non-linear. We know it doesn't happen in a straight line, so we don't get developing athletes or children through soccer academies at 8-9 years old and then they all progress successfully in a nice linear fashion to become professionals at the other end. We know that's not reality. We know reality is that there are going to be ups and downs, there are going to be twists and turns throughout that journey, setbacks, achievements, disappointments, great successes. So we need to be able to help athletes and the people around the athletes to better understand this journey, and also to help develop the skills, qualities that are required to be able to successfully navigate this journey and overcome some of those twists and turns that we know are inevitable. So I guess the picture is pretty clear in the sense that talent development is complex. It's not a simple process, but seemingly we want to spend a lot of time trying to simplify this complex process, which on a surface level makes sense. It makes it more manageable, it makes it more straightforward, but we know that reality is different. And I guess one of the great debates which gives an example of this idea of where we want to simplify talent development down is this idea of deliberate practice versus sports sampling, or early specialisation versus late specialisation. And we know that each of those arguments has their merits and also has the drawbacks. So we know that when we talk about some of Ericsson's work around deliberate practice and early specialisation, we know that intense practice at a young age typically correlates with performance level, but we also know that comes at a cost. There can be some increased risks of burnout, overuse injuries, identity foreclosure. When we know that people's identities become fused with what they do in sport, that can be a real challenge, not only in sport but later on in life. We know it can make coping with failure, injuries, deselection problematic. We know that this may result in an increased pressure to succeed when people have spent such a long time investing both in time and money and effort of parents, coaches into developing skills from an early age. It can create a condition where there are great expectations on young people, which unfortunately can result in a sense of failure when these expectations are not met. But we also know on the other side that early specialisation does have a place in talent development, or deliberate practice, more specifically, should I say, has a role to play in successful talent development. And we can see that when we look at how deliberate practice does, in most cases, correlate with some success later on. I guess what the challenge comes when people consider this to be the only way, to reach success, reach senior level, and for it to be successful. And we know that that's not the whole truth. And we can look at that when we look at the different types of sports, and we know that certain sports may be more aligned to this idea of a sports sampling or late specialisation approach to development. And we've got some good examples here on the right hand side of the screen with two images of the same athlete. So we have Jimmy Graham. If those of you are not familiar with Jimmy Graham was a basketball scholar at the University of Miami and didn't switch to playing football until his final year of his college education, and that was only by chance. After switching to playing football in his final year, Jimmy went on to have a career in the NFL even, where statistically the chances of a NCAA football scholar being drafted to the NFL is 1.5% of NFL players will be drafted. 1.5% of NCAA players will be drafted. But then we must remember that Jimmy Graham wasn't a football scholar; he was a basketball scholar. So we know that the chances of that statistically are quite low, even much lower than 1.5%. But I guess what this does tell us is that maybe the complexities of some sports mean they may be more suited to early specialisation, whereas others may be more related to or more applicable to this idea of a late specialisation. So we can estimate that for Jimmy Graham, for example, as a basketball scholar, to be something around 0.0% chance, 0.009% chance, of being drafted to the NFL, and we can get those figures when we look at the your regular high school players who will go on to be drafted. So we can maybe use that as a bit of a comparison to go, hey, there's something else going on here. It can't just be about specialising in a sport from a really early age, because we know that we've got stories of athletes who have gone on to be successful despite only coming into a sport late, or coming into a sport at a higher level much later than what people may expect. What this does tell us is that there is no single pathway to success in sport, and that pathway is likely to be determined by the nature of the sport, the context, time, cultural beliefs of particular sports and countries, and then the skills, abilities and characteristics of different individuals may predispose them to certain types of sport. So we can get the picture that it's really complex, that there is no one definitive pathway, which leads us to then question So why are those of us who are working in talent development, those of us who are working in professional soccer, why are we seemingly becoming obsessed with trying to plan, structure and manufacture this talent development pathway when we know that much of it is very complex, much of it is very uncontrollable, yet we're trying to control the whole thing? Perhaps one explanation for this, as we've alluded to already, is this idea that we're maybe looking for a simple answer to a complex problem, and perhaps that makes sense in some levels because, as we said, it makes talent development a little bit more complex and straightforward. If we try to control everything, it helps us feel like we know what we're doing, like things are logical and planned, but we can question this when we look at the reality of talent development, because talent development isn't this clean, controlled, neat process in reality. So I guess the challenge for us is, how do we reflect that in our practices? How do we understand and incorporate those ideas into what we do? So I guess we can then question, well, what's this got to do with psychology? And actually we can say there are some parallels between these ideas in talent development, where we're trying to make things very controlled, clean, and deliberate. We can pass over some of these criticisms to psychology traditionally, which may often be reactive, solving problems, dealing with issues, focus on weaknesses in this very narrow sense, in the same way that we might try to look at talent development in a narrow way. But the major factor, which has been voiced in recent years, is that too often sports psychology is focused on the individual athlete. We know this can be a challenge because, particularly developing athletes in team sports such as professional soccer, individual athletes do not develop in isolation. Athletes are going to be influenced by the people that are around them. They're going to be influenced by the culture, context, time of a particular organisation and environment. So perhaps focusing just on the individual from a psychological development perspective may also be quite limited in its effectiveness, because we know that there are going to be a range of factors which are going to influence how that player feels, how they experience the time in sport. We go back to the example at the very beginning about the coaching example. Give me an hour with any player and I will make them better. Well, we know that there are going to be a range of factors which are going to be making players better. We know that the relationship that they have with a coach, the way that their interactions with the coach is going to influence them psychologically. So if I spend the whole of my time just working with individual athletes, I may be hitting some barriers there if I'm not recognising or addressing some of these broader factors, such as parent-athlete relationships, coach-athlete relationships, peer-to-peer relationships within the environment. If I'm not addressing these things, then individual athlete work is likely to be quite limited. And when we look at some of the parallels again between psychology and talent development, I guess both of these approaches have led us to focus too heavily on the individual athlete and the characteristics they possess. So are they big enough, quick enough, resilient enough, and has led us to focus too much on the volume and type of training activities they engage in. So have they practiced enough? Have they played enough games? Have they developed enough of a broad repertoire of development experiences in different sports? And each of these positions, I guess, has led us to this position where maybe we are being a little bit reductionist, a little bit too mechanistic in the way we view talent development. And we can see this when we look at some of the references in popular culture. Quite often people will talk about talent development environments, particularly in professional soccer, as being talent factories. Over the years, people talk about Clairefontaine as being this talent factory. They may, in more recent times, talk about successful academies in developing players as being talent factories. We can see examples of this, where all players are coming through, and this idea that it's about production, that we are producing, we are developing athletes in these controlled environments, and then they come out the other end as senior players, and we can question the reality of this, because we know that it isn't this controlled, neat process. We know that by trying to simplify things and control things, that can be a good thing for the staff who work there, because it makes us know what we're doing. It gives us a recipe to follow. But what are the implications of this way of thinking on the staff when there is an expectation or there's a belief that it's our job, our responsibility to develop and produce athletes? Does that increase the pressure on the staff? How does that pressure on staff to produce players, how does that influence the way that they interact with developing athletes? How does that influence parents and guardians if they believe that their child is involved in this talent development factory where they're going to be successful, when we know that reality, the numbers don't quite stack up? We know that success in terms of reaching the elite senior level is going to be quite limited. We know the numbers don't quite add up there. And how does this then also influence the young people? If we've got parents and guardians who are getting excited about them becoming senior athletes, if we've got coaches who feel under pressure to produce athletes, how does this play out and influence the young people? And I think these are important questions for us to consider.